This is Trad Lab. I'm Cody Greenwood, and today we're going to nerd out on draw force curves. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to interpret the graphs that I put on here with my bow reviews so you can find the right bow for you. We'll also do a little myth busting and probably generate some hate mail.
Welcome to Trad Lab, where the bows speak for themselves.
The goal of Trad Lab is to help people who can't try their equipment before they buy it make an educated decision on what they should buy. Today, as I said, we're going to go into draw force curves and the ergonomics of a bow and bow length and the effect bow length has on those different metrics. As I start dropping these bow reviews, I'm not going to stand there and talk about how great the bow is and how much I love the bow and how beautiful the wood is. I can't do that because it will bias my output of that bow. I'm going to post the graphs, the results, and I'll speak to key characteristics if there are any, and I'll tell you if it's an outlier. I'll go through a few outlier examples today so you can see what I'm talking about. But it'll really be up to you to evaluate the graphs to determine what works for you and what doesn't. I'm going to go through the change per inch graph and the traditional draw force curve graph. Today I'm going to walk through why I prefer the change per inch graph because it shows more as to what the archer feels versus the draw force curve, and I'll explain that. I often hear that ergonomics and draw force curve don't apply to the hunter. I couldn't disagree more. There's more place for good ergonomics and a good drawing bow in hunting than there is in any other space in target archery. We often have to draw and hold. We often have to draw under pressure. And one of the biggest issues that I see with hunters is that they can't stay at full draw long enough to aim the bow well, whether it's an instinctive aim, whether it's gap, or whatever your aiming purpose or choice is. We'll get back there and we'll let go. Bows that are tighter in the back or that stack in the back, and I'll help you define that by looking at these charts, they enable that. They make you want to let go of that bow faster, and they will literally give you that form of target panic. Target panic being defined as any aspect of the shot that you're not controlling. A more forgiving bow with a smoother draw force curve and a consistent linear climb tends to be more forgiving and help you shoot a better shot. All right, this is your traditional draw force curve. The draw force curve shows the sum of weight per inch. So for every inch that you draw, you're picking up typically 2 pounds. On bows that stack, you're picking up 3 pounds. I've seen some bows that will pick up 5 pounds. What this draw force curve shows, and this is what was traditionally used to evaluate bows, is that sum of gained weight as you draw. So you're seeing that curve slowly rise, unless it's a super curve. There's 3 or 4 lines here that you see peak up early and then smooth out. Those are big hook limbs like what you see here. This is a backwoods composite. Actually, one of the bigger preload ones up there is this limb. They load up early and less in the back. The long bows are very linear, and a recurve typically has kind of a smooth approach and then kind of a nonlinear curve to it. What this will show you, if you look carefully, is where a bow stacks. But as you can see, it's kind of hard to delineate between a smooth versus a stacky bow because the difference in graphs is very, very minute. I'm going to compare later some 58-inch bows to some 68-inch long bows so you can see how tight it actually is. On a graph, it looks close, but in reality, stacking is extreme, and people would feel it completely, the difference between drawing a nice, smooth 68-inch bow and a stacky 58-inch bow. In this draw force curve, you can typically see, if you squint your eyes and kind of look at it, you can see a signal as there's a linear pull that comes up, and then around inch 25 or 26, you start to see some of those lines take a nonlinear shift up. That is referred to as stack, when the bow starts to stack. It's not terrible to have a stack right behind your draw length. I actually prefer most bows. I'm a 28-inch draw. At 28, if I have something to move into and expand into, I really like that type of draw cycle. I'll move my brace side up or down to kind of move that into place. But smooth out to 31 is really, really nice and very hard to find. For you long draw guys, you really need to pay attention to this because it's very, very critical. You could hit the wall at 29 inches and still have another inch or two to go, and it's miserable. You're never going to get settled. You're never going to get your shoulders down. You're never going to be able to expand. Why I don't like the traditional draw force curve is because it really doesn't discriminate very well. It doesn't have enough magnification, if you will. If you look at my change per inch, think of it as going from 10x to 40x. Now we're looking, instead of the sum of weight, we're looking at the incremental change of weight. So my scale just got us a lot more precise into what we can see and what we can't see. Now we can start to see some real outliers in terms of smoothness. And remember, I have around 2 to 3 tenths air in my measure. Most of that air in my measure is early in the draw force because I stand right over the 28-inch mark. So where it counts, I'm really, really accurate. When I say I have air, it's usually way up early because I'm standing here and looking down, or it might be over here. But right over 28 to the 30, I'm pretty accurate. And what the change per inch shows us is when there's a sudden change from 1 or 2 pounds to 3 to 5 pounds. And you will really feel that. And I find that this graph represents the archer's feelings about the draw force much better than the traditional draw force curve. So you'll see me using this quite a bit. All right, here I have an example of a draw force curve where I've just taken a handful of bows instead of 20 or 30 bows. I have a small handful here. And I want to walk you through how to interpret this graph. The green color indicates 68 or 70-inch target bows in this situation, and the gold represents 58-inch hunting bows, just because I wanted to clearly show the difference for you. One of them is a complete outlier. I told you earlier that I would help you spot outliers so you would understand what I would say when a bow's abnormal. I made the dotted line on the Gremlin. This is a big stick Gremlin that was 58 inches that was made for me to test. I paid for it. I'm not endorsed by him or anything like that. And I tested it, and I knew right away that it was abnormal. And you can look at this little 58-inch bow, and this thing shares a change per inch graph of a 68 or a 70-inch target bow. That's completely abnormal for the type of design that it is. That bow would fall under an R&D longbow design, and although they're smooth, they're typically not this smooth at that length. So as I evaluate bows, I can compare them to their subgroup. So I can compare R&D longbows to themselves. I can compare mild R&D longbows to themselves, and straight-limbed ASLs. They're their own subcategory. You don't want to compare, say, a Widow to a Superhook. You don't want to compare a hill style bow to a Superhook. So we're trying to create standards on this channel for each one of these groups for you to evaluate the bow and have fair expectations of it. Right now, looking at this graph, the Gremlin exceeds expectations for the style and size of bow that it is. Here I have a 62-inch Hoyt Velos that was on a 19-inch DOS Tribute riser, which had a lot of D-flex. I have a 62-inch PA, which is this exact PA here that I tested, and I have a 64-inch PMA. They were all of very, very similar weights, and they were all tuned and had the appropriate brace height. And what you see here is you see a change per inch graph that's rolling across, and at around 27 inches, we see some movement. And that's when you start to see a little bit of a shift. But we're talking sub 2 pounds at this point per inch versus 2.5, 225. These things are really, really smooth and they're very, very consistent, right? You're getting 2 pounds, 2 pounds, 2 pounds. You're not getting bumps and you're not getting hit any stack here. And in this graph, I can see that even for a long draw person, someone who draws 31 inches, I could comfortably recommend this isn't the Hoyt, but this is the same length as the Hoyt ILF limb. I could recommend the Hoyt Velos at 62 inches. And with the appropriate brace height, it's not going to be an 8.5-inch brace height. They're going to drop it quite a bit. They're going to have a comfortable limb. I could certainly recommend the PA and the PMA because they're smooth as well. To me, it's pretty cool that we have wood bows that hang in the ergonomics department of top of the line ILFs. So I thought this graph was really, really interesting. Again, I'm not going to do a lot of head-to-head comparisons, but I thought this was really good. All right, now we're going to get into the myth-busting portion of this. Whenever you're making a decision for a total length of bow, which is what this is about, it just happens to affect ergonomics across really every design. And it also affects speed in some designs more than others. So we're going to talk about those exceptions right now. I hear it all the time that, oh, you need to get into the limb. There are two Black Widows here that we just looked at the draw force curves on them, and they were basically identical, one being 64, one being 62. There's a slight advantage to the 64. And when you look at the speeds between 64 and 62, they're right there with one another. 180, 180, 173, 173, 168, 168.75. So that's a 62-inch Widow PA versus a 64-inch PMA, and they're neck and neck in terms of speed, even though one's 2 inches shorter than the other. And that really had me looking at, this getting into the limbs because I assumed the smaller recurve would get faster. Now, at some point, I think we would get faster because there's just going to be less mass. Here's the power stroke analysis I did for Widow. And here you see across the top two different limbs for the PMA. One was wood and one was carbon. Or actually, I should have titled that glass and carbon. In the wood or glass limb, you have 10 grains per pound, 11 grains per pound, and 13. I wanted to go heavier. Heavier arrows tend to make more efficient bows really show up, which is why I didn't go 12. I jumped up to 13. And here you can see the speeds across 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30 inches of draw, that span of 26 to 30. I chose that because I figured that was a pretty good span. And the 10R, what you see there, that's the range. So that's the delta between 26 and 27 inches is 8 feet per second. So this lets me quickly see if there's a sweet spot in these limbs that a 26-inch draw is getting to. Now, I did all of this on a shooting machine, so it should be extremely accurate. And you can see in this case, they're all very linear. They all grow in 6 or 8 feet per second climbs. If there was a sweet spot in a limb, I would expect to see, 6 feet per second, 6 feet per second, 8, 10, 12 feet per second, 6 feet per second. You don't really see that. What you will see on certain limbs, when you hit stack, you'll see more speed, but that's because you're not pulling 2 pounds every inch. You're now pulling 3 pounds per inch. I don't know if that's what confuses people, or if the concept of loading longbow limbs may be carried over into recurve. That's why I said this does depend on design. But in a traditional recurve, don't make your bow length decision based on performance. Here's another power stroke analysis that I had done. In this situation, I had some RCTX limbs that I had tested from Dryad. They're not a standard curve ILF limb. They're a little bit more aggressive than your standard curve. And it was early in my trad lab career, but I tested them under scrutiny and the right specs. As I tested them, I found that the speeds weren't where I thought they should be, and I reached out to the bowyer at that time. And the bowyer told me I wasn't getting into the limbs. So, and I didn't know, so I tested this. This is me just trying to determine if he was right or not. And I run a similar study where I go 26 inches to 31 inches, and I show the climb is very linear. So there's no real sweet spot here. There is a jump from 30 to 31 inches, but when we look at the change per inch for these limbs, they go from pulling 2 pounds to 3-something pounds here. So you're pulling more weight. But this was the first signal in my studies that said, you know what? I don't think there's a sweet spot found on a traditional recurve limb. There may be some exceptions out there, just like we saw there was some exceptions with the 58-inch bow that drew similar to much longer bows. But for the most part, if you're making a decision on total bow length, don't let performance dictate you making a choice for a longer bow. You're getting into the limbs just fine on a 64-inch bow. Does that mean you should go to a 74-inch bow? Probably not. But the average hunter is going after 60 to 64 inches. Man, I'd go for a 64-inch bow if you can stand it. To simplify this, the best quote I ever heard was actually Calvin in an IBO Masters interview the Push did, and he said, shoot as long of a bow as you can stand. And put simply, that's more effective statement than anything I'm putting in front of you now. If you hunt in a situation where you can handle a 66 or a 68-inch bow, that's what you should certainly hunt with because it's more forgiving and you're more likely to get that perfect arrow flight that we know is very, very critical because that's, to me, more important than speed. What I'm saying in terms of length of limb and length of bow applying to performance does not apply to big hooks. These big hooks are a little bit more particular about draw length, and you need to work with each individual bowyer to make sure you're well within their specs, because if you run them out of specs, you're going to have some problems on your hand. The bigger the hook, the more sensitive it is to that, so it doesn't really apply. This also won't apply to longbows, especially straighter limbed longbows. So I have probably on the wall behind me. I have a Liberty English in 68, and I just got a Liberty English in 64. The 64 is going to be significantly faster than the 68. One advantage longbows have over short bows, whether it be a recurve or a longbow itself, they are more resistant to tiller issues, meaning if you have variation in your bow hand grip or variation in your string hand grip, they're a little bit more robust to your error. So they're going to be more forgiving to shoot by their very nature. The other advantage longer bows have is string angle. It has a better string angle, which helps you get off the string cleaner. I did a study last year, I think, where I was comparing bow lengths, and I lost a statistically significant amount of points shooting 300 rounds, different bows, when I dropped below 60 inches. When I went below 60 inches, I could really see a difference. I could see an incremental difference from 60 to 64. Then I saw kind of a step function improvement at 66. And then after that, it waned out. It's going to be different for every archer. If you're a 230 to 250 archer on a 300 round, that's probably going to be the experience you have. If you're a super great archer, you're probably going to think I'm crazy that I couldn't shoot the difference between a 66 and a 72-inch bow. But I'm just not good enough. But I could shoot the difference between 60 and 58. So when I make a decision to run a short bow, so for example, turkey season, I have to hunt out of a blind. I found that a 60-inch bow shoots out of a blind for me. I can get the clearance that I need with a 60-inch bow. I chose this bow, which is the KB. So if I'm going to have to go with a short bow, I want to have a lot of deflex. This bow gives me the deflex. I want to have mass in the riser. This bow gives me that, and it improves, it mitigates my ability to torque it. It's called moment of inertia. What the Widow also has that I like, because a lot of bows have this, Bob Lee's going to have deflex. Bob Lee's going to have mass in the center. You can see some Tolkies behind me. They're going to have mass in the center. What the Widow has is it has a better string angle. A 60-inch Widow string angle is going to be better than almost any other string angle on the market. So you get a more forgiving bow in a shorter bow. I don't like short bows at all. I have this KB just for blind hunting, and it does really well for a short bow. But if you buy a shorter bow, you need to anticipate that you're not going to shoot it as well as a longer bow. All right, here's another outlier. Here's another example where what I'm saying doesn't make sense. This was a test done on a WF 29-inch riser, which was when the 29 was brand new. You have to imagine a 29-inch riser is massive. This is a 21-inch riser. Step out of the way here. So imagine a 29. It's a monster, right? And CD Archery has slightly different geometry on their 29 than they do the rest of their lineup. It's a lie. The 21 and the 29 share the same geometry. The others share their own geometry. Nevertheless, I was testing limbs on this bow because I'd never messed with a 74-inch bow before. Here you can see trad techs, and this is across different yardage. So testing speed, I was actually doing a study on cast here. Testing speed across 0, 10, 25, and 30 yards. And you can see the shorts are faster than the longs. So finally, we're at a point here where I'm not getting into the limbs. I finally have an example of where my 28-inch draw length isn't getting into the limbs on a 74-inch bow. That's how far out I had to go and how extreme I had to get to find that average opinion to be true in terms of recurves. So here is an example where if you buy the WF29, medium is actually optimal. We've done the study there. The medium limbs have a great draw force curve and speed. But if you have a really short draw length, you want to go with a longer riser and shorter limbs in terms of that 29. But this is the one example where I see that stand true. I wanted to make sure I pointed it out. The statements that I've made today are not absolute statements. You have to apply them to every design of bow that we have here. Here at the very top, you can see a wingard that's made of G10, that's got a 21-inch riser. That thing is stable as they get, and it has fairly aggressive limbs on it. That bow is going to shoot very, very different than the bow just underneath it, which is a Tolkien SS 50 style recurve, which is also abnormal for a 50 style recurve. It is very smooth and very fast. Underneath that, you have the Whip 10X. You see the limbs starting to get straighter and straighter and straighter. That's going to have a steeper curve or a tighter curve than the SS. The SS is smoother than the Whip because of these curves. The PL and the Whip are neck and neck. And then you can kind of see me keep going down. That's a Fox traditional. You can see that curve getting a little bit less aggressive until you finally drop down into mild R&D. And then the mild R&D, that's a Minnesota stick. And then you get down into a 2-tracks, into a Liberty English, all the way down to the ASL. So as you go up this, you get more speed, you get more forgiveness, and you get completely different draw cycles. So depending on the bow you want, I'll give you metrics where you can compare within that subgroup of bow and determine what's good and bad. This way, every bow gets a chance because there's certainly space for ASLs and mild R&D longbows. Hopefully, you can leverage the graphs that I'm going to provide in this channel on the bow reviews to help you choose the best bow for you. Your draw length, the scenarios in which you hunt, and the design of bow that you want to hunt with will dictate your total bow length. Just know that the longer the bow, the more forgiving that bow is going to be. There may be some exceptions out there, but they're few and far between. Depending on the bow, length does certainly affect performance, like for longbows, especially longbows with straighter limbs. For your standard recurve, we don't see that much gain. Every bow that I have ever tested is lethal, and I have self bows here that I would not be afraid to go out in the field with. Lethality is not a problem with our equipment. I think we get sold on that. Accuracy is the problem with our equipment and with us. So if you're choosing equipment with this channel, don't think in terms of feet per second. Don't think in terms of draw force curves. Think in terms of what bow could I pick that would allow me to shoot 5 bear shafts and get the exact same result? What bow would I pick to shoot through paper 3 to 5 times and get bullet holes if that was your goal? Then ask yourself, all right, now I know what bows I could probably do that with based on what makes a bow forgiving, which we'll break down in this channel. Now ask yourself, what kind of trajectory can I live with? Am I a Midwest hunter that lives in oak stands and my average shot is 12 to 15 yards? If so, you don't need a fast bow. I was having some successful shots last year with 134 feet per second with full pass throughs. You need good arrow flight and an accurate bow. So really evaluate what you need, the scenarios that you hunt in, and hunt with as long of a bow as you possibly can because there's advantages to both your robustness to tiller variation that comes from your grip and your string hand. We'll dive more into that, which gives you better cast. We'll dive into the string angle, which will give you a cleaner release, and also the better ergonomics, which, regardless of what anyone tells me, I know ergonomics matter even for a hunter. I hope this video adds value.